Senator Rand Paul is back with us from the great state of Kentucky, well-known Tea Party supporter. And how are you, sir?
Good. Good to be with you, Sean.
All right, so we got these two competing plans, and we've been talking to the leadership in the House about their plan. And look, if I don't know what the specific cuts are, we've been burned too many times before. And I can give him credit where credit is due on a lot of things that they've gotten done. And they voted in the House to repeal Obamacare, and they voted in the House for cut, cap, and balance, and they started the process with the Ryan plan, which is better than the White House has ever done. And, they're talking about another balanced budget amendment, forcing the Senate to actually have a real vote this time. But if we're going to hand this off to a debt commission, why should any of us have any faith in it?
Well, I guess my biggest problem is that this plan, which they say will cut $1 trillion, actually cuts $1 trillion off of a baseline that will add $9 trillion. So really, we're talking about adding $7 to $8 trillion to the debt over the next decade.
Explain this. You got to go through this so that people that have no idea what baseline budgeting is about understand it. So you have to explain it in detail.
This is exactly where the problem lies. I'll give you a contrast. Connie Mack is a House member, and I've signed on to a plan of his. It would balance the budget if we cut the budget by 1% every year for 6 years. Now, you scratch your head and say, how could you do that with only 1%? That's because all of these other plans imply that the spending goes up 7% every year. The baseline is what everybody argues against. The baseline is an artificial plan that is set in motion, and it goes for 10 years. So the baseline plan, the Congressional Budget Office's plan, goes up every year. Spending goes up and debt goes up, and it adds about somewhere between $8 and $10 over the next 10 years.
So every time they come up with a plan, what you're saying is they're assuming an increase in spending of 7%. That's their baseline.
All of their cuts are against proposed increases in spending. That's why the whole dramatic thing of Connie Mack's plan, cutting only 1%, because it's against a baseline that would have zero growth. And that's what most Americans would understand is if you spend more next year, that's an increase of spending. If you spend less, but it's not a cut if you still spend more than you spent last year. Connie Mack's plan that I've signed on to, it's called the penny plan, is you cut real spending, a real 1% every year for 6 years, and it's enormous, the savings against the baseline. But the baseline's going up every year, so it's really they're trying to trick you in the sense to say, oh, we're going to cut $1 trillion, and the American public says, oh, well, that's a lot of money. It is a lot of money, but they don't tell you that they're going to increase the debt by $9 trillion according to their baseline.
Well, why are we just hearing, we've heard about this before, and I've argued about baseline budgeting for years and the danger of this, and this even goes back to 95. I mean, Republicans then proposed reducing the rate of growth at that point to 7% a year, and they were demagogued as kicking grandma over the cliff and into, her deathbed.
Well, I think that's why ultimately it has to be about, and that's why I like this penny plan. It's 1% a year. It doesn't sound draconian. It is a cut, but we would then be talking about real cuts and not cuts and proposed increases.
When you say across the board, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, defense, everything.
Here's what it says, though. It says that spending has to be cut by 1%, but it doesn't tell Congress how to do it. But what I like about this plan is if Congress doesn't do it, then it's across the board. So if you and I both think that national defense is a priority, we may say, well, we can't do it there. We need to cut it elsewhere, and we think the Department of Education needs a 10% cut or a 10% cut. So there are ways that the legislators really get to prioritize where the cuts are, but you have to wind up with a real 1% cut. If you don't do your job, then it's across the board.
Well, it seems to me, why haven't we been arguing this earlier? That's even better than cut, cap, and balance.
Well, cut, cap, and balance is an alternative also, and it has a balanced budget amendment, and I think the balanced budget amendment is important, but ultimately we're going to need to get a majority up here who would support something like a real 1% across the board and not I guess it's an illusion to think that any of these plans out there will help us. I think Moody's and S&P are going to see through all of these plans. I think that if they're doing their job as a rating agencies, they're going to downgrade us because none of this makes it look like we're serious about correcting our problems.
You see, something like this is very understandable, I think, for the American people because these plans get confusing. There's a lot of obfuscation here. if we're projecting out what the cuts are, somewhere down the road, there's no insurance that that's going to happen. If there are accounting gimmicks, we can't stop that. If we're using a baseline budget that assumes, growth of 7% in every budget for every year, people don't know that. We don't know, for example, if they're going to gut defense. This seems pretty simple to me. I mean, we could tell the American people, take a test, and I think 90% will get it by the next day.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about this plan that's coming forward, the plan that will come out of the Republican House, the only cuts for this next fiscal year will be about $6 to $7 billion. That's not even a drop in the bucket. You can't even measure that as a percentage. That's what's going to be the top line cuts. The top of the line cuts will be $6 to $7 billion. And you remember when we had the spending bill in the spring, we started out wanting $100 billion. We compromised we prorated to $61 billion. We compromised to $38 billion. And then in the end, when they added up the real cuts, it was about $300 million. That's what's going to happen to this. Once this plan becomes further known, you're going to find out there's upfront cuts, and that most of it is promises that future Congresses will have to keep, but there's no guarantee that they'll keep those promises.
Why do I doubt guys like you and Paul Ryan and Connie Mack and Jim DeMint are going to be on this, Gang of 12 panel in the end that's going to make I bet Chuck Schumer and Dickie Durbin are there.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about the panel is I really don't have as strong an objection to that, because there was a committee a long time ago during World War II called the Harry Byrd Committee, and I've actually been promoting that concept that it would look just at debt reduction. Now, I would like to have the language firm that says that it only looks for ways to cut waste, debt, and spending, and that really tax revenue needs to go through the tax committee in normal process. And I think then I'd feel more comforted if this committee only dealt with debt reduction and it was an expedited way to do debt reduction. It's still not enough to get me to support the plan, but I would feel more comfortable about the committee if its sole purpose was debt reduction.
I've got to ask you this. How are your colleagues reacting to this? Because it seems like the predictable, TARP panic, stimulus panic, we face catastrophe, to quote Obama, panic. Old people are going to be robbed of their Social Security. Panic is now taken over there.
Well, we had a press conference this morning with conservative senators and conservative House members, and at that press conference, I basically said that this is a manufactured crisis, an artificial crisis. The president should be ashamed of himself, and the president should immediately come forward to the American people and say that he won't default on the debt, that he will pay the Social Security checks, and that he will pay our soldiers' salaries. He should take that off the table, because if something happens August 2nd and the market goes down, I think the blame is squarely on his shoulders.